Geomorphic processes. So let's start with geomorphology. Geomorphology is the study of how landscapes change over time. And the geomorphic processes are the processes that happen to create that change. So it's the breaking down of material, the removal of material, the transportation, and then eventually the laying down or the deposition of that material in a different place. And for the purposes of GCSE, we're mostly thinking about river systems and coastal systems, but these processes are happening all the time, all around the world, on lots and lots of different landscapes. So our first category is weathering. Weathering is the decomposition or disintegration of rock in situ, in its original place. So there are lots of forces acting on the rock, breaking it down. And we split weathering into three categories. Mechanical weathering is some sort of physical action that's breaking it apart. So our first image at the top there shows freeze-thaw weathering. Water seeps into the cracks in the rock. As it freezes, it expands and starts to break that rock down, and that continual freezing and thawing starts to weaken the rock until it breaks apart. And we see that happening generally in sort of high areas, the Lake District, parts of the UK where we see certain times of the year the temperature consistently dipping below zero, particularly overnight. We've then got salt weathering. This is the picture, second picture on the right. This happening a lot along the coast where we have salt water crashing and splashing against rocks. And salt crystals forming, which again put that physical pressure on the rock and break it apart. Secondly is chemical weathering. So some kind of chemical reaction happening with the minerals in the rock that break it down. So if we have particularly acidic rainfall, for example, it might start to break down limestone. And a great example of this here is some limestone paving. There we can see in the Yorkshire Dales, where the acid has worn away and has the chemical reaction has broken down the rock to create this limestone paving. And then the final category is biological weathering. So this might be the burrowing of animals into the ground. It could be, for example, in your image at the bottom there, tree roots pushing and breaking the rock apart. So our second category is mass movement. And this is the downhill movement of sediment. So that's our rocks, our soils, mud, due to gravity. And three examples here, we've got rockfall. So our rocks have become loosened or weathered away, and maybe it's particularly windy conditions and we see them falling down slopes. Rotational slumping and mud flows both tend to happen when we've had lots of rain, the ground becomes heavy and saturated, and the force of gravity pulls that material down those slopes and gradients. So our next process is erosion, which is the wearing away of material. And remember, we're thinking about this in the context of river and coastal systems. So first up is solution or corrosion, which is where water dissolves certain types of rock, such as limestone and chalk. So it's a chemical reaction. Minerals in the rock are being dissolved into the water. Corrosion or abrasion is this sandpaper-like action where little stones are scratching away at the banks of the bed, banks and bed of the river. So as the river's flowing, as the water's flowing, the particles within it are scratching and scraping away. Also happening along the coast, on the cliffs and the seabed. Then we have attrition, where we have the stones in the river or in the sea bashing together and becoming smoother and more round. And that's why we see these pebble beaches. We see those lovely round, smooth pebbles. They would have started life as much more jagged, sharp rocks, but over many years they've been bashing together and smoothing round to form those lovely round pebbles. And then our final type of erosion we call hydraulic action, and that's where water hits the banks of the river or the cliff face. It compresses air that are trapped in little pockets or little cracks in the cliff face. And as the water recedes, the pressure that's released forces those cracks to break apart. And again, that repeated action is going to see that happening more and more. So 4 types of erosion we cover there. Now we move on to transportation, which is how that material that's been eroded or weathered away is transported and moved through those river and coastal systems. So first one is solution. You'll notice that's also a type of erosion, and it's the same principle. So the water dissolves those minerals in the rock, and that material is then moved along through that system as a solute load, so it's dissolved into the water. Next up we have suspension. I should say, as we're moving down here, the size of the particles in the water are getting larger and larger as we go. So next, small particles are just suspended and carried along in the river or the sea. Then the larger particles, we have saltation, where they're going to be hopping and jumping. The waves or the river, the current in the river has energy to lift and move them, but they don't maintain their being held in the water. They're dropped and leapfrog over each other. And then finally, the really large boulders and rocks get rolled along the seabed or the riverbed by the power of that water moving down. Our final geomorphic process is deposition. This is where the river or sea loses its energy and it drops the sediment that it's been carrying. It no longer has the energy to carry as much sediment or as heavy or large particles, so they get placed down. And a really good example of this would be the creation of beaches. So as the sea comes towards the coastline, it gets shallower, loses its energy, and drops sand, pebbles, particles it's carrying down, and that over time will start to create a beach environment.